I think the last year has brought around so many challenges for so many people that COVID has put a big strain on so many people's personal and professional lives, and also obviously caused a lot of pain. But somehow between all of that, there have been some glimmers of hope for what is hopefully a more positive, more optimistic way forward. I think work is one example of this, with so many people having kind of shift their expectations and now working from home or in a flexible way so much more. It begins to suggest a new way for how we might be living our daily lives. So, in London, which is where I'm from, there's traditionally been an enormous commuter population, which means millions of people each day taking the train into the centre of the city. And that is both at enormous expense both in terms of sort of financial expense, but also in terms of time, people spending 2 hours a day travelling. So now we can say, well, what does it begin to look like if those people are not spending all that day on a train, but are instead working, amongst their friends and family and in their own communities? And I think there's an enormous opportunity there for the revitalization of local high streets and local towns. That's why I've just started a new project called Patch, and we're building neighbourhood workspaces. And the purpose of that is to build really dynamic spaces in the centre of towns outside of central London. And that will enable people who've traditionally commuted to spend more time working in their communities and more time with their friends and family. And I think there's a huge number of positive externalities connected to that, from investment in local businesses and local high streets, to also actually fundamentally new relationships and new forms of collaboration with people who, whilst they live together, very often might not have actually met each other, and for the first time working together, and therefore hopefully some really positive impacts in terms of determining the spatial futures of the towns and cities and places where they live. I think a public space that's incredibly special for me is the Regent's Canal in London. The canal systems in the UK were sort of the critical industrial infrastructure of the Victorian era, bringing goods, from the Midlands or from the north into central London. And so actually they were never really seen as a public space at the time, because they were the highways of their era. They were noisy, they were dirty, they were smelly. And so architecture and public architecture was certainly never built to address them, because they were these sort of back routes into the city. And now we're at this turning point where people are beginning to realise what an amazing asset the canals are to the city. And so we increasingly have developments which are being built to address them in a more open way. So one good example would be the development at King's Cross, which is Granary Square and Coldrops Yard, where we see for really the first time in history public buildings being built to address the canal. And so at this point in time, there's this interesting balance between the past and the fact that actually it is still a very quiet and beautiful space to walk in London, and then these moments where you sort of suddenly encounter the future, where you meet a kind of, where there are big steps up to a large public square. And I think that it kind of, as this space which meanders through the city, it kind of gives you such an interesting insight, both into, the city of the past, but also the city of the future.